right.
Are we rolling?
Yep.
Fantastic. All right, today is November the 7th, 2017, and I am Dan, how was that pronounced again?
Posternuck.
I think it's Pasternak.
Okay, fine. Do it your way.
Oh, all right. Well, you know, we can clean it up in post. In Posternak. No, Pasternak. I'm Dan Pasternak, and it is my honor to be interviewing my friend Alan Zweibel for The Interviews, an oral history of television and the Writers Guild Foundation here at the Friars Club in New York City. Let's go.
Wow, you're a good reader. That's great.
Thanks,
You'd
pal.
be good.
Watch your left side, Dan, in action.
All right, Alan. Starting at the very beginning, please give us your name at birth.
At birth, my name was Alan Zweibel, Alan Mark Zweibel, and I believe I was 6 pounds, 3 ounces.
Healthy baby.
Yeah, thank you.
So when and where were you born?
When? In 1950, that was the previous century, right? Smack in the middle of the previous century, and I was born in Crown Heights Hospital in Brooklyn.
Now, what was your exact date of birth?
May 20th, 1950.
All right, just checking. All right, that lines up with what I have here. So good. So far, you're about in 1,000.
Wikipedia, I told you not to use that.
All right, so Crown Heights is where you were born?
Crown Heights in Brooklyn, which is heavily Hasidic.
And is that where you grew up?
No, I grew up in Brooklyn. I grew up what I guess is called the Sheepshead Bay section of Brooklyn.
Okay.
Okay, Avenue V in Nostrand, 2932 Avenue V, apartment 5C.
That's very specific.
Okay. Yeah. My sister Franny and I had the bedroom in the back.
All right, this is
Yeah,
good.
thank you.
If they're going to be running tours now, the Alan Zweibel
Yeah,
tours,
absolutely.
they know where to
a
go.
little plaque over that. What is now we'll talk later what it is now.
Okay. So now, how long did you live in Brooklyn?
Lived there for 8 years.
Okay.
Then moved to Long Island, to Wantor, Long Island, South Shore, where Jones Beach is located.
Okay.
And then my father had a couple of really good seasons in the jewelry business, so we moved to the Five Towns. We moved to Woodmere, which is also on the South Shore, and I graduated Hewlett High School in 1968.
So now, talk a bit about your parents, just their names and sort of what they did.
My father, Julius Zweibel, they're both alive. My father's 91. He manufactured jewelry. He worked here. His place of business was always here in Manhattan, a couple of blocks from where we are right now at the Friars Club. He was on 52nd between Madison and Fifth Avenue, and he manufactured really fine jewelry. He sold to Cartier and Tiffany and places like that, so real high-end stuff. My mom, Shirley, was a housewife. She was the mother of, there were 4 of us, so that was a full-time job.
Now, where did you fall in the birth order of your
I was
siblings?
the oldest.
You were the oldest.
Still am. It's not like any of the siblings got older than me. You know, I still am the oldest.
Oh, good. Okay.
Yeah, no, I've maintained that position.
So, do you think that there's any, I don't know, talents or tendencies or personality traits that you inherited from your parents? And if so, what do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I think to a great extent, it's more about an attitude. My mother's funny. My father, not so much. Good guy. But the culture of the household was not to take things overly serious, you know, that life presents you with obstacles and stuff, and you deal with it, you know. So there was not a lot of moping, there wasn't a lot of gloom, and so it was the attitude in the household that, all right, how are we going to handle this, you know? And as far as any culture was concerned, that also exemplified what the household was like. You know, it was, it was Shalom Aleichem. It was Benchley. It was, there was. I remember as a little boy listening to Fibber McGee and Molly when my mom would play it, and quiz shows, and it was fun. There was a philosophy about it. Grandparents too. They came over from Europe, but there was always an attitude that things could be worse, you know?
I like that. So now, what were some of your interests growing up?
Well, it was sports. Sports were my prime interest: baseball, football. I played baseball all the way through college, football up until college, and you know, I followed sports, but those are the ones I played. I also threw the discus on the track team in high school.
Oh, wow.
Yeah,
Didn't know that.
sure. That's the beauty of me. See, I'm like an onion, which Zweibel means, by the way. Zweibel means onion, Siebel, swivel, Sibyl
Wow.
in German, hence the breath. That's why you're sitting so far from me, I can tell. But you can peel me.
That's
in
why
a
I
way.
always want to cry in your presence.
Well, a lot of people tear up. Yes, they do. Especially when I'm trying to be funny and they go, oh, God. They start weeping.
So now, at what age do you think you started discovering writing or being funny?
Good question. I think when we moved from Brooklyn to Wantor, I was 8 years old. I was the new kid. And then when we moved again to Woodmere, when I went to Hewlett High School, I was 15. I was the new kid. And especially the second time we moved, I was like 15 years old, a sophomore in high school. I was a good enough athlete to make the teams, but I was funny and people were attracted to that. And I think, you know, Lyndon Johnson was the president, and Alan Sherman had these wonderful records, you know, these parody songs that he sang on the Ed Sullivan Show and Hello Mudda, Hello Fada. And what I did was, early on, I started writing my own parody songs a la Alan Sherman about President Johnson and the economy and whatever was going on. And I wrote this.
Do you remember any of those songs?
Let me think if I can remember any of them.
Even a couple of lines.
Oh, cut down the taxes, please, LBJ. Our cost of living is getting higher each day. Taxes on food, cars, and even on cheese. My best pair of pants is my new dungarees. Okay, and there was another stanza, and the last verse of it, the last line of it was signed Hubert Humphrey, and that rhymed with whatever came before it, who was the vice president. And
so now, how old would you have been when you wrote that?
14. And then I started writing poems to get out of tests oh man, we had a teacher named Mrs. Mommer in English, and I was failing or doing something not commendable, and we had a test, and I forgot all about it, and I wrote a poem to her explaining why I couldn't take the test. It's useless, Mrs. Mommer. There's nothing I can do. For all last week I had fever, not to mention the flu. When Matthew called, I'm sorry, I can't remember. It was, and I should be, because it was only a mere 51 years ago.
But clearly,
Yeah.
your salvation, even from an early age, was your creativity and your wit.
Well, there was a poem that I wrote. I wonder if I remember this. And this is sort of like what turned heads of, like, when I started throwing the discus, and I was still somewhat the new kid. My nickname in college, in high school, was Zweib. And the reason it was is because when I moved to the new school, the old school had us stencil our last names on our gym shorts, on the back of them. So it's Zweibel, E-I-B-E-L, but since it's E-I, and the kids in the school shortened it. They said Zweib, because it looks like Zweibel. So they started calling me Zweib. And to this day, those friends, it will be my 50th high school reunion next year, still call me Zweib, okay?
Wow.
And I remember writing a poem called Zweib at the Discus. And it was in the style of, well, let's see, at 7th, because I used to practice in the mornings before school started. At 7:30 yesterday morning, passers-by could have sworn they saw a boy and a man who looked so smart. The kid was Zweib and his coach, Jim Hart. Okay, the kid had...
It was like an Ogden Nash kind of
well,
reader.
it was more Casey at the Bat, because
right,
it was...
right.
Well, I got to start all over again. Coach Jim Hart. This lad had biceps like that of steel, a physique so good you'd swear not real. Just look at him and say his name. You know this kid was destined for fame. With speed greater than that of light, one moment here, then out of sight, like a flash across the sky, it's Zweib's discus flying by. So so in late March at his first meet, his opponents he thought would go down in defeat. So a sailor, a senator, a West Point plebe would tell their friends they saw the great Zweib. But after 2 throws, Zweib's opponent led. There was little cheering and not much said. Zweib got up, discus in hand, trying to prove that he's the best in his land. He turned, he spun, a sight to behold, with the courage of a man, courageous and bold. I know the last stanza was, in Shea Stadium the poor Mets lose to Sandy Koufax and all those Jews. But in Hewlett, Zweib made a poor show of it. The stupid fool forgot to let go of it, okay? That I'm sure, I know it led to there. It got mushy in the middle. But, you know, so I'm
glad we have that preserved now for posterity.
It's written somewhere. I'm writing my own memoir for Abrams Books, and that could very well go in there.
That's fantastic. All right, now since this is for the Television Academy, I know you mentioned listening to quiz shows and Fibber, McGee, and Molly on the radio. What are some of your first memories of television?
Well, first memories of television back then were cartoons on Saturday mornings, but also later in the afternoon, you know, there was Abbott and Costello, there was the Three Stooges. As a kid, I never got Laurel and Hardy, and I know you're supposed to say, oh, Laurel and Hardy was more highbrow or better than Abbott and Costello. I just know Abbott and Costello made me laugh. And the Three Stooges, as much as my parents didn't like the idea that their son was laughing at, you know, Moe hitting, you know, Curly over the head with an anvil, you know, I thought that they were okay. Cowboy shows, you know, The Lone Ranger, and a little later on Paladin and Wild Bill Hickok and Rin Tin Tin and Lassie. The seminal show for me, though, which made me want to think about going into what I'm doing, was the Dick Van Dyke Show. And I know that just about everybody my age, if you speak to Paul Reiser or Richard Lewis, we all say the same thing. And for me, I would say I was about 12 years old, and here was this guy, Dick Van Dyke, good-looking guy, married to a very pretty Mary Tyler Moore. They had a really nice house in New Rochelle. They had a family because they had a son named Richie. And he'd spend his days at work lying on a couch, you know, joking around with Buddy and Sally. And I went, I think I'd like to do that. How do you get to do that? And so that made an impression on me, you know. And years later, when I got to meet and become friends with Carl Reiner, it was very good friends with him and Rob, his son, obviously. It was quite an accomplishment. For me, it was a milestone, because here it was, you know, we're very lucky to do what we're doing. We get to lots of times meet people that we influenced us and idolize. And then if you're luckier, you get to work with them. And if you're extremely lucky, you get to become friends with them. And, you know, Carl Reiner and Mel Brooks are high on that, you know, list. You know, they became very good friends. They came over for Passover, you know, my house. You know, Carl would ask the 4 questions, and Mel would say, I answered them last year. Come on, let's eat. You know, so, you know, this is what the house my kids grew up in, and God, it was fun.
That's amazing. All right, so obviously the Dick Van Dyke Show planted the seed for you.
Well, yeah, I mean, I just wanted, that world looked interesting to me. The behind the scenes kind of, the goal was to be a writer, a TV writer. All I wanted was to have my name on the screen, you know, in the crawl at the end of a show. That was, I watched shows like That Was the Week That Was, which was a weekly live show from Rockefeller Center, you know, from 30 Rock, and it had David Frost was the host, and Bob Dishy was on it, and my good friend and mentor Buck Henry. You know, once again, there's another example of somebody he's one of my closest friends, and you know, but I used to, when my dad had his place here on 52nd Street, no matter, you know, and I used to run errands for him during holidays from school and whatever, wherever the errand had to go, I would always go by way of 30 Rock, and make sure I go through the lobby, because Johnny Carson had the Tonight Show upstairs, and That Was the Week That Was, and there were people doing what I wanted to do someday.
Now, were you doing this before you ever started pursuing comedy writing?
Oh, God, yeah. This is 13 years old. I'm 12, 13, 14 years old. Always went by way of 30 Rock. You know, I knew that there was a guy up there named Herb Sargent who was producing That Was the Week That Was, and he later became another collaborator and mentor, because when I got to Saturday Night Live. So I've been really lucky that way. You know, another guy, you know, and I know it's not TV, Dave Barry, who I'm working with a lot right now, you know, grew up reading his stuff. You know, he's only a few years older than me, but I'm very, very familiar with his stuff. And we're about to embark on our 3rd book together,
So when did you start pursuing this in earnest, and how?
Well, in earnest, what I did was, when I went to college, I went to the University of Buffalo, because I had this urge to freeze my ass off, okay, for 4 years. So I chose Buffalo to be the place. And I lived in a dorm, and I was a resident advisor, probably the worst RA in the history of any dormitory on any campus in not only this country, but any civilized country, and possibly some of the uncivilized countries, if indeed they have dormitories in RAs there. But what I did was I used to write jokes and mail them in to The Tonight Show, and to Dick Cavett had a show, and to Mad Magazine. I have at home a folder still about yay thick of all the rejection slips I've ever gotten from Mad and every conceivable variety television show that was on at the time.
Any of these places, shows, ever use any of them?
Well, some of them were close enough. See, I mean, like, if I would send jokes into Dick Cavett, let's say, okay, and there was no email back then, so I'd mail something from Buffalo on Monday. And by Thursday, if it was still topical, you know, I'd watch the show, and so let's say you wrote a joke about the snowstorm, right? They didn't take my jokes, but my jokes were close enough to theirs, to what the professional writers were writing. And I go, wow, maybe I have something to offer. It just encouraged me. I didn't, you know, same thing with Mad Magazine and the Carson Show.
So now it's really interesting to me, because this is really a formative state for you. Are you studying how those different shows, and particularly shows like with Cavett or Carson, they obviously have a very specific voice. Johnny Carson's voice is very specific. So how conscious is it for you in trying to write to those voices?
Well, what it was is that that's where I started to learn and to teach myself adaptability because not everybody sounds the same. You know, I was drawn more to, let's say, Cavett because I thought that there was an inherent wit there, where Carson, who's fantastic, obviously, was a little broader, all right? But I did write many, many Karnaks and sent them in. Later on, well, I will get to it if we're doing this chronologically, but what I did was I knew that they would probably be looking for something that sounded good coming from this specific voice, you know what I mean, in terms of syntax and rhythms. So it was, I don't think it was conscious, but it was just, it was something innate, going, okay, this is how he might say this, you know. And then when I graduated college, and dozens and dozens of law schools encouraged me to go into comedy writing, what I would do as an exercise, I would designate a week, and I'd say, okay, this is the week where the subject is buying a house. And on Monday, I'd write a monologue as if Jack Benny would deliver a monologue about buying a house. And Tuesday, the way Toady Fields would have done it. And Wednesday, Richard Pryor. By the end of the week, I had 5 monologues about the same subject, but with 5 different points of view, 5 different sets of jokes. And because I sort of knew that I'd want to write scripts someday, and I didn't want everybody to sound alike.
And so did you sort of just invent this
Yeah,
sort of process of self-teaching?
Yeah. Yeah, it was, and anytime I mention it, nobody else has said to me, oh, I did that too.
It's fascinating.
Oh yeah, I'm a fascinating person.
I think we agree on that.
No. Look at them. They can't, they're texting and things. I thought I was more enthralling than this.
All right,
Go
so
back to what you were doing, it's fine.
All right, so you're submitting jokes all over the place.
Yeah.
You're at least feeling
Earl
like...
Wilson.
Huh?
Earl Wilson, the columnist for the, what was it, the Post? Or the Daily News, one of those. He was the gossip columnist, and at the bottom of every column, he covered like the Broadway beat. And he would have a joke that he wrote, said that he wrote or put in the mouth of a comic. You know what I mean? Morty Gunty says that you know, the parking fees are so high that such and such and such and such. I sent him jokes to put in his column. I knocked on every door imaginable.
All right, so talk about when you started to get like some traction writing
Well,
jokes.
the traction is all due to my mother. When I graduated college, I moved back home, and it was the scariest summer of my life because, well, all my college friends were home, but come September, they all went to med school and law school and grad school and dental school, and I'm home. And I got a job in a delicatessen on Hillside Avenue in Queens, and you name it, I sliced it for about 2 years. And what my mom and dad went to Lake Tahoe, and they saw a show starring Engelbert Humperdinck, and the opening act was a Borscht Belt comedian named Morty Gunty. And I remember as a kid, he had like a kid show on in New York on like WOR called The Funny Company. And I sort of remember the name because it was a goofy name, Morty Gunty, you know. And he was the opening act, and my mom ran into him in a coffee shop in the hotel the next day and said that her son wanted to become a writer. He gave her his address and phone number and said, have him write me some jokes and mail them to me, and I did. And he called up and he liked them, and he bought a couple. And
what were some of those first jokes? Do you remember them?
yeah, they were not that great. They were, you know, I'm 21, and these guys, all these Marshmallow guys are 45 and 50. It was like writing for my parents. But I write one joke. Is he the next interview? I'd write these jokes about my grandfather has an electronic pacemaker in his heart, which works great, except every time he sneezes, the garage door goes up. You know, jokes about Florida, how my grandparents live in this, you know, old folks home down in Florida called the Wrinkled Arms. And outside they have a kidney-shaped swimming pool, and every day, just to make it a little bit more realistic, they put little stones in it. You know, it was, these were, you know, and they played up in the mountains. You know, it was something you didn't say too loudly to your friends.
Now, did you ever go with them up to the mountains?
Oh, all the time. I would go up with, I'd go to their homes. They lived in New City, which is in Rockland County. And the reason they chose, a lot of them chose to live there, Freddie Roman and Morty Gunty, a comic named Dick Lord, another guy named Vic Arnell lived in nearby Suffern. Myron Cohen, if you remember that name, he also lived in New City. And the reason they chose New City, it was a suburban area, but it was sort of halfway between Manhattan and the Catskills. So they can come into the city, come to the Friars Club. They all had a manager named Dave Jonas, who had his office here, but they were equidistant to where they worked, which was up in the Catskills. So I would borrow my mom and dad's car, let's say on a Friday, and I'd drive up to one of the comics' houses. I'd work with them that day on material that I had already sent them, or trying to come up with new stuff, have dinner with them and their family, and then get in the car with them and drive to the Concord, the Browns, Grossingers, you know, any of those places, Stephenville, the Nevele, the Raleigh, all those places, and watch them. I'd sit in the back of the, am I allowed to drink water on this show?
I believe so, yeah. I don't know if we have to Greek out the label, though.
And sit in the back of the nightclub and listen to my jokes.
Now, what did that feel like?
It felt great. I mean, look, I wrote something that somebody was saying and other people were laughing at. That was the purpose. But it was also frustrating because oftentimes they would change it. And you go, no, I know it's supposed to be the way I wrote. And they would change it to something that I thought was ridiculous, you know. And they paid me $7 a joke. That was the going rate at the time. Straight
up $7, no matter how well the joke did.
And that's not true. Well, some of them were real assholes about it. Am I allowed to say asshole in this thing? Some of them were real assholes about it, and they'd come off the stage and go, oh, you know, that joke about paving the driveway went into the toilet. And they go, gee, I heard laughs. And so we would barter, and I'd go home with like $4. Yeah, so some of them were real pricks. So the guys I just mentioned were really nice, though.
Now, I know at some point you started writing jokes for Rodney.
Well, Rodney came later, and Rodney was the first name, big name, and Rodney was fun to write for because he had a persona. He had that I don't get no respect thing, so it was real easy.
Now, how'd you get to Rodney? Was it just by reputation that he knew you were writing for a lot of people, or did you approach him?
That's a good question. I think Richard Lewis introduced us.
Oh, wow.
I was hanging out with Richard Lewis, and we went over to Dangerfields.
To his club?
To his club.
Yeah.
I'm almost positive that's how that happened. So, and it was real, he always made me laugh. And so it was really easy for me to have him say, I don't get no respect. Even as an infant, my mother wouldn't breastfeed me. She said she liked me as a friend. You know, that was easy for me to do. it was easy for me to say, no one in my family ever got any respect. During the Civil War, I had an uncle who fought for the West. Okay, that was.
I've never heard that one.
Okay, you see. Okay,
You're killing it here.
yeah, no, look at this. So, so that was easy, you know. Whereas the other guys, they were just jokes. There was no persona. There was no nuance. That's why a lot of them didn't.
See, that's really interesting to me because so many of the writers that I've spoken to who wrote for someone like Jack Benny or someone who wrote for someone like Rodney said that with a well-established comic persona, they feel like it like elevated their game because they knew so much going into writing for those people.
Well, yeah, it elevated the game, but what it also did, it was easier because you knew what the guy sounded like. He had a cachet because he was already a character. So it was joke writing, but it was also, you know, they would bring nuance to it. They would bring character to it.
Now, did Rodney rewrite your jokes? Because I know he was a very disciplined writer.
He didn't touch anything that I wrote, to my knowledge.
Really?
At least not in front of me. God knows what he did with it. But
now, I know you say you met him through Richard Lewis. So now, at that point, have you started performing?
well, what I did was after a couple of years, I grew bored of writing for the Borscht guys, and prior to my arrival there, you know, a decade earlier, certainly 2 decades earlier, it was it was a hotbed of comedy. It was a breeding ground. You know, that's where Alan King and Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis and all these people started. Buddy Hackett, you know, they moved. They honed their craft there. They became really accomplished comedians, and then they went out to Hollywood and got their own shows, you know. By the time I got there, the number of hotels were dwindling. They were hanging on for dear life, hoping that gambling would come to the Catskills and you know, give it a much-needed shot in the arm and revitalize it, as it did with Atlantic City. But they were running on fumes, and it looked like it wasn't in the cards, which it turned out it wasn't in the cards. And I looked around, and somebody told me about the Improvisation a showcase club here in New York, and another one called Catch a Rising Star. And that's where the Richard Lewises and Larry David and Freddie Prinz and Robert Klein and Lily Tomlin and Bette Midler, they would come. This was the new breeding ground. So I took all the jokes that these old guys wouldn't buy from me, and the plan was to go on stage and deliver them as a writer, just to people could hear my material. And I had every hope that a manager, an agent, you know, those kinds of people who were hanging out at these places would like the material and help me get a job writing television.
So now, what was your performing style?
It was shaking and sweating. It was a style that I brought. Big Jew, schwitzing. You know, it was. You know, now I do talk shows and I do a lot of speaking engagements, but my God, back then I was just terrified, and even when I was doing SNL, I was a writer, but they always used the writers as extras. I was so scared. Gilda would always, you know, like give me a shot of whiskey and push me out there, and you know. There were times where I had to play a dead person, and if you look closely, my hand was shaking. It was just, now it's fine. But back then it was, so I'd go on stage, and if they laughed at the joke, great. It was just a recitation. But if you needed a performer to play the room or pull it out of them, I wasn't your guy. You know?
Now, were you getting paid spots, or are you basically doing what now is called open mic?
I never went to an open mic.
Okay.
Never went to an open mic.
So how did you get past it? You know,
I got past it because of Richard Lewis once again.
Okay.
Richard Lewis and I were both managed by this man named Dave Jonas, who was to a great extent, was part of the Woody Allen's influence for Broadway Danny Rose, the character Broadway Danny Rose.
Oh, wow. I didn't
From what I understand, he was an amalgam of a few characters, but Dave Jonas was certainly one of them. And that's how I met Richard. I think I met Richard that way through Jonas. I know I met Freddie Prinze through Jonas.
How'd you meet Billy?
I'll get to that in a second. But with Richard Lewis, I think at the point that I decided that I was going to try to do stand-up, Richard was already my friend. And when we went to the Improv, he told Bud, well, if you need a guy to do 10 minutes or whatever, he pointed to me. They threw me up there on a Friday night as the first comedian. And it was an easy audience for me to do because they were mostly suburban men and women from Jersey and Long Island. I come from Long Island, and the material was geared for them, you know. So I worked myself into that rotation. As far as Catch a Rising Star is concerned, I also didn't have to do open mic. And I think I got on because I delayed going there. And I might have been I already had, people already knew that I was sort of funny. And they said, oh, why don't you try Alan? It was something, but I was also coattails. It was Richard Lewis. I met David Brenner, which was a big thrill because he was very nice to me. And he said to Rick Newman, this is a funny guy. He pointed to me. And they threw me up there, and it worked out, okay? So I never did open mic night. I don't even know that I didn't, and it was all because of friends and favors. You're asking how I met Billy. I was hanging out at Catch, and he was just starting out as a single performer. He was, prior to that, he was a member of a trio, a comedy trio. And I keep asking him what the name of the trio was. It was something like We the People, but I'm not sure that that's it. But maybe it is. I have no idea. Okay, we can check it. But, and I don't know how it came about, but I found out, we found out that we lived 3 towns from each other. I lived with my parents in Woodmere on Long Island. He lived about 3 or 4 towns over in Long Beach. He was already married and had a kid. And because he's more mature than I am, okay, fine. So what he would do is he would pick me up every night at my parents' house. We'd drive into the city in his little blue Volkswagen. We would tell our jokes. And then he would drive me home, and we would listen to the cassettes in the car critiquing each other. And we became friends right away. And I also met Larry David back in those days. Probably Larry at the Improv because he hung out there more so. Billy hung out more at Catch. And Larry David and I just hit it off immediately. I used to sit in the back of the room and watch him and think that I had never seen anything like this before.
Well, now the stories of Larry's combative relationships with audiences back in that day are pretty legendary. Do you have any?
Well, yeah. I mean,
that?
look, I know that if I followed him, let's say, usually, you know, the person before you does 20 minutes. So if Larry has the 9 o'clock spot, well, you'll go on at 9:20. But if I followed Larry, I would get there at 9 o'clock because on more than one occasion, he walked off at 9:01. You know, so I would go on. But just marveled. There are certain people that we've all met, and I've been very privileged to have met a handful of them who are on a different plane than everybody else. You know, there is a tacit, and sometimes not so tacit, competition. Oh, damn, I should have thought of that joke. Oh, shit, I could have written that sketch. Oh, that was my idea for a screenplay. You know, obviously it's all in the execution, but, you know, if you feel that somebody's sensibility is similar to yours or yours to theirs, you go, damn, they beat me to it. I should have done that. With certain people, I know at SNL it would be Dan Aykroyd and Michael O'Donoghue. At the Improv, it was Larry David, certainly Andy Kaufman. I mean, Andy Kaufman was just on a different planet. I had never seen anything like it, but Larry, I would sit in the back, and today, I think of like Dave Barry and, we write together, but what he sends me when we collaborate, I couldn't do that. It's not, Shandling used to do that too. Gary and I, when we wrote our show together, Gary would call me, in the middle of the night and say, Alan, my dog's penis tastes bitter. What do you think, it's his diet or what? And I'm going, wow, I can't write that joke. Wow. Wow. Alan, I had a date last night. How did it go? Well, we were in bed, and the girl said, no fingers in the ass. And I said, look, it's my finger, and it's my ass. And if that's where I want to put it, you don't have a vote. I'm going, wow, I live to be 1,000. I can't write that joke, So there are certain people that you just marvel at what they do. Larry Gilbart, I had the honor and privilege of spending time with him, and I just, but Larry might have been the first person that was my friend, but at the same time, I was a fan, because he operated on a little different plane, and does to this day. Even when I worked on Curb Your Enthusiasm with him, and I've written things for him, we respect each other, and there's an alchemy there, which is good. But at the same time, I'll take what I think he's going to like, which is a little, off the charts when it comes to the normal realm of thinking, if you will, and he'll still take it in a direction that I probably couldn't.
But still, I would think, given the way you sort of self-trained in writing for other voices and that Rodney experience,
right?
Because Larry has such a specific voice, I would imagine that all of that discipline and thoughtfulness you brought to that process must have made being able to write for Larry, who you knew personally and you knew comedically so well, like it probably put you,
it put me close, but I don't live there. Okay? It put me close. I go, okay, what would Larry do with this situation? There was a speech that I helped Larry write when Steve Martin was given the Mark Twain Award. This is a number of years ago. And that's the same occasion I met Dave Barry. It was about 10 years ago. And they gave him the Mark Twain Award, which is like the Comedy Lifetime Achievement Award, and it's down at the Kennedy Center. And Steve wanted Larry to speak. And he didn't know Larry. So I got a hold of Larry and I said, Steve wants you to speak. I said, well, I'll do it if you help me write the speech and you come to Washington with me. Okay, fine. So I helped him with the speech. There's also footage of, I won something called the Thurber Prize for a novel that I had written. And when they gave me the award, they put a bunch of my friends on tape saying why they couldn't come to Columbus, Ohio to be there at this award ceremony. Big thing, 1,500 people, big fundraiser. And in it, Larry and I did something, It's a great tape. It's Rob Reiner and Buck Henry and Gary Shandling and Letterman and Billy and Larry. And Larry and I did something there together. And so there's always, and on the one episode of Curb Your Enthusiasm that I was an actor on, which was improv. Okay, yeah, it worked because I know him, I know what he'll react to, and whatever. But left to my own devices, it's not my sweet spot. I admire it, but I live in a slightly different place in that. Yeah, I can capture it, I can inspire him, but I have to go, all right, What would Larry like? What would Larry react to? Like you do with most people you're writing for. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a little give and take. It's a collaborative process.
Well, it's a collaborative process, but once again, you take something like this and make it jump like that.
All right, so you've been in this sort of comedy world. You've obviously forged a lot of great relationships. Talk about that moment where you got the opportunity to put yourself in front of Lorne Michaels for SNL.
Well, I didn't know I put myself in front of him. He had seen me bomb at Catch a Rising Star, and I went to the bar afterwards, and I didn't know who he was. I was just waiting for Billy to get done so he can drive me home. And Lorne told me, he introduced himself, but I didn't know who he was. I don't even know if he said his name. He said he liked my material, and he wanted to know if I wrote it, and I said, yeah. And he said, could I see more? I would have shown it to like a gardener at this point, you know, and he was combing the clubs for writers and actors for this new show.
Now, what was your first impression of him just as a guy?
I thought he was sort of cool. I thought he was sort of cool. He had nice hair, and he was funny, smart, but funny in a way that I admired. Just like I said before, that I was probably more drawn to Dick Cavett and the George S. Kaufman and the wits, you know, the Groucho even, as broad as the Marx Brothers were. I mean, Groucho, there was a wit there. You read his letters, and they're hilarious. Yeah. Okay, and you read letters from a mangy lover, and all of this. They're really funny. And so it was the Dorothy Parker, it was the New Yorker, and Lorne. There was something there was a wit there was an intelligence to it. Whereas, don't forget, my background was the Catskills, which was more, you know, and here there was wordplay, and there was a subtlety, and I was drawn to it. The tongue-in-cheek, the slight sarcasm, the subtle put-down, and so I thought that he was real smart, and a man named Leon Memely, who was a agent at William Morris, was friends with my then manager Dave Jonas, and said they're looking for writers. Should we put Alan up for it? And I went there and I showed Lorne 1,100 jokes that I had written at my interview with him, because I took all the jokes I'd written for all these other guys, jokes that I'd written for myself at this point, and I had a book this thick, you know, and I got this phone call. I think it was on my birthday, my 25th birthday, in 1975, that I got this job on this new show. Here's an interesting thing, just to show you, and it sounds absurd at this point. The same day, certainly the same week that I was told I got a job on this new show, I got a phone call that I was offered a job to write the questions and bluff answers for Paul Lynde on the Hollywood Squares. How that happened was Toady Fields was managed by a man named Howie Hinderstein. A lot of the comics that I wrote for were her opening act. So when I would go see them open for her at some theater in the Round or some big venue like Westbury Music Fair, I became friendly with Howie. He managed, in addition to Toady Fields, I want to say John Davidson. And these were people who were on the Hollywood Squares a lot. So he was close with those producers, and they said they were looking for a writer or writers for Paul Lynde. I wrote a bunch of questions and answers for Paul Lynde, and I gave it to Howie Hinderstein, who submitted it for me. Now, at the time, I'm working at a deli, and all of a sudden I get these two offers. And Hollywood Squares was network, prime time, going into its 9th season, West Coast where the whole industry is, higher pay scale, had all these stars that came into the squares. All of them had their own shows, all of them had their own Las Vegas acts. This was, what a great entree into the business. As opposed to the Saturday Night Live thing, 11:30 to 1? Who the hell's up watching TV? Who the hell's John Belushi? East Coast, late night, you make like $1 an hour? What's this? I gave it all of like 15 seconds of thought. It was a momentary consideration, but my mom said to me, well, which one will you have more fun doing? Well, I said, this one, this Saturday Night Live thing. So that was the decision, but it gave a brief moment of pause to a kid who was living at home, working in a deli, and what was, wow, the two breaks, so that were a concurrent, So I took the SNL thing.